I'm Claire Matthews, a 42-year-old single mom living in a quiet suburb just outside Seattle. It was late October 2014, and the Pacific Northwest was drowning in rain, the kind that soaks through your bones and turns the world into a grey blur. My daughter Sophie was 4, a bubbly little thing with curls that bounced when she laughed. That day, we'd spent the afternoon at the mall, an escape from the dreary weather, picking up groceries and a new pair of rain boots for her. By the time we headed home, dusk was settling in, and the rain hammered the windshield like it was trying to break through. "Mummy, can we get hot chocolate when we get home?" Sophie asked from the back seat, her voice muffled by the crinkle of the shopping bags she was hugging. "Sure, kiddo," I said, smiling at her through the rearview mirror. "With extra marshmallows, just how you like it." She giggled, kicking her feet, and for a moment, the world felt warm despite the storm outside. I pulled into the parking garage of our apartment complex, a squat, brick building nestled between evergreen trees. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting flickering shadows as I grabbed the bags and helped Sophie out of her car seat. Her tiny hand gripped mine as we trudged toward the elevator, rain dripping off our coats onto the concrete floor. The air smelled of wet asphalt and rust, and a faint unease tugged at me. Maybe it was the emptiness of the garage, or the way the rain echoed like distant footsteps. We stepped into the elevator, and I pressed the button for the 5th floor. The doors were sliding shut when a figure darted in at the last second. A man in a bright yellow slicker, the kind fishermen wear, with a hood pulled low over his face. He carried a bundle wrapped in soggy newspaper, clutched tight against his chest. He didn't look up, didn't say a word, just stood in the corner, water pooling around his boots. Something about him set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or how his hands gripped that bundle like it was alive. I tightened my hold on Sophie's hand, pulling her closer until her shoulder pressed against my leg. "Stay near me, sweetie," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, her big brown eyes darting toward the stranger. The elevator hummed as it climbed, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I stole a glance at him. His slicker gleamed under the harsh light, and I swore I saw a dark stain seeping through the newspaper, red against the gray. My stomach twisted. When the doors finally opened on our floor, I practically dragged Sophie out, desperate to put distance between us and him. But then I heard it, the squelch of wet boots behind me. He'd stepped out too. My heart thudded as I quickened my pace down the dimly lit hallway, Sophie's little legs struggling to keep up. "Mummy, why are we running?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "Just a game, honey," I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his presence, a shadow trailing us, like a predator stalking prey. The hallway stretched endlessly, the faded carpet muffling our steps. My keys jangled in my shaky hand as I fumbled for the right one, my apartment door just a few feet away. When I reached it, I dropped the grocery bag in my haste, apples rolling across the floor. I bent to grab my keys, and that's when I saw him. He'd stopped, maybe 10 feet back, standing under a flickering light. His hood cast his face in shadow, but his eyes glinted, unblinking, locked on me. I shoved the key into the lock, my breath hitching as I pushed Sophie inside. "Go to your room, sweetie. Quick," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. She scampered off, clutching her boots, as I turned to slam the door. But he was closer now, close enough that I could hear the drip of water from his slicker hitting the floor. "Wait," he said, his voice low and gravelly, almost swallowed by the hum of the storm outside. He took a step forward, raising the bundle in his hands. I froze. The door half closed, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Please, my husband's home," I blurted out, a desperate lie. He's waiting for us." My voice cracked, but I held his gaze, praying he'd buy it. For a moment, he didn't move, just stared at me with those cold, hollow eyes. Then slowly, he lowered his arm, the newspaper crinkling as it shifted. I caught a glimpse of something metal poking out, a hammer, its head slick with something dark and wet. My knees nearly buckled. He turned almost reluctantly and shuffled back down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I slammed the door, locked it, and slid the deadbolt into place, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the knob. Leaning against the wall, I tried to catch my breath, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the rain. Sophie peeked out from her room, her face pale. "Mommy, who was that man?" she asked, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Just someone lost, I think," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's make that hot chocolate, okay?" She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Neither did I. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the windows, jolted me awake. I kept thinking about those eyes, that hammer, the way he followed us. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, and I'd never felt so alone. I checked the locks 3 times, peering through the peephole into the empty hallway, half hoping, half dreading I'd see that yellow slicker out there. The next morning, I called my neighbor, Jenna, who lived 2 doors down. "Did you see anyone weird in the building last night?" I asked, cradling the phone as Sophie ate her cereal. "Some guy in a yellow raincoat?" Jenna paused, her voice dropping. "Claire, I heard someone pacing the hall around midnight. I looked out and saw a guy like that. Yellow slicker, hood up. He stopped at your door for a good minute, just standing there. I thought about calling you, but then he left." My blood ran cold. He'd come back. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push it out of my mind. Seattle's a big city. People pass through, right? But every time it rained, I'd catch myself scanning the streets for that flash of yellow, my stomach knotting whenever I saw anything close. Sophie started having nightmares, waking up crying about the Rain Man, and I couldn't shake the guilt that I'd brought this fear into her life. Then, one Saturday in January, everything changed. I was folding laundry in the living room, the TV droning in the background, when a news report caught my ear. "Authorities have arrested a suspect in a string of brutal murders across the Seattle area," the anchor said. "The man, identified as Victor Hensley, is believed to be responsible for at least 15 deaths over the past year, targeting women and vulnerable individuals in isolated areas." The screen flashed to a mugshot, and my heart stopped. It was him, the man from the elevator, his hollow eyes staring back at me, the same ones that had pinned me in place that night. Sophie wandered in, clutching her bunny. "Mommy, why do you look scared?" she asked, tilting her head. I fumbled with the remote, muting the TV. "I'm fine, sweetie," I lied, my voice barely steady. "Why don't you go play in your room?" She nodded and toddled off, but I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking as the report continued. They called him the Raincoat Killer. He'd worn that yellow slicker in every attack, luring victims with a disarming smile before bludgeoning them with a hammer. The news showed grainy security footage, him stalking a woman in a parking lot, the same slicker gleaming under streetlights. Police found a stash of bloody tools in his apartment and, God help me, they said he'd kept trophies, pieces of his victims, locked in a freezer. I gagged, pressing a hand to my mouth, the image of that stained newspaper flashing in my mind. That night, I called Mark, my voice trembling as I told him everything. "Claire, you're safe now," he said, his tone firm but shaken. "He's locked up. He can't get to you." But safe didn't feel real. I'd stood face to face with a monster, inches from becoming one of those headlines, and Sophie, my little girl, had been right there with me. I started researching Victor Hensley obsessively, digging through articles and forums. He'd lived just a few miles from our complex, a drifter who'd bounced between odd jobs. Witnesses mentioned his eerie calm, how he'd linger in places like he was hunting. One survivor claimed he'd hummed a tune while chasing her, a detail that made my skin crawl. I remembered the silence in that elevator, the way he'd watched me without a word. Had he been sizing me up, waiting for the right moment? Months later, I found a crumpled note slipped under my door, an old grocery receipt stained with rainwater, dated the night he'd followed us. Scribbled on the back in jagged handwriting was, "Next time." I don't know if he'd left it that night, or if someone else had found it and slid it under later, but it shattered any peace I'd rebuilt. I moved us out of that apartment the next week, to a new place across town. But the fear stayed with me. Now, when it rains, I double-check the locks, keep a bat by the bed, and watch Sophie like a hawk. I've taught her to scream if anyone she doesn't know gets too close, to trust her gut, like I wish I'd trusted mine sooner. That yellow slicker haunts my dreams. His eyes, his hammer, that quiet menace I'll never forget. If you're ever in an elevator and see a man in a yellow raincoat, don't wait to find out what he wants. Run. This is Claire, signing off from Stranger Shadows. If you've got a story that keeps you up at night, share it below, and don't forget to subscribe. Stay safe out there.